Okay, so here are some success points I think for this course that based on my experience teaching, what I see students do and what I see students fail to do, particularly as it relates to papers as well as participation in other assignments. So I crafted this as a top 10 success points. There are no real particular order, and they just pertain to overview points. So one, all papers and presentations should pique my interest. I'm pretty well versed in the intelligence and terrorism and law enforcement literature, but I learn something every time I read The Economist or I read the New York Times or an academic paper. Your papers and presentations should do that. You should write it in a way that has an angle that is interesting to me. And as much as we have rubrics and we have other things, I'll be honest, what really gets me reading is if you capture my attention and I'm genuinely interested in what you're trying to say. So you should aim for that in your papers and presentations. You should have a strong thesis statement. Every paper should have a thesis, and it should be clear and apparent at the onset. Don't make me fish around for your thesis. Don't make me do anything where I'm not sure what argument you're trying to lay out. It should be crystal clear and understandable. Use headings and subheadings in papers. Even in these short papers, there should be headings and subheadings that lead your argument or lead your argument down the line. And again, if I'm reading, 15, 20 papers, the first thing I do is I look at the headings and subheadings of each paper before I start reading it, so I know where your logic or where your argument is going. So please use those in your paper. Each sentence and paragraph should introduce new evidence. These papers are short, and what I mean by short is you have to be precise with your language. There should be no there should be very little background information. There should be very little extraneous thoughts. Every paragraph or every sentence should earn its way onto your paper. And that's the best way to look at it when you're writing these short papers. Some of you might think, oh, it's only 1,500 words. I can knock it out in a day. No, that's not the right answer. And whether it's in this class or in the real world, you have to write very concise, very short, to the point, where every sentence has to earn its way onto a position paper or papers in this class. For participation in discussion boards, again, you're going to have about 1 to 2 of them every week. Incorporate lectures, readings, current events, personal analysis. That's the way to get the best grade, is if you could kind of incorporate all of that into your discussion posts. Every paper presentation should have solid recommendations. Maybe not the first one, but especially you might be able to get away with it. But the second and third papers, you're analyzing failures and you're trying to figure out what the failure is. So if you analyze a failure and you determine what the failure is in the intelligence process, you should have recommendations to fix that failure, and they should flow from your analysis. So again, we're going to be looking at intelligence failures in history. We're going to look at future intelligence failures, and you should, instead of just identifying it, you should also be able to make recommendations in analysis or organization or funding that solves the intelligence problem or mitigates the issues related to the intelligence problem. Do not give me a history lesson. This course uses history, and we have historical examples going back to Pearl Harbor and 9/11 and the Yom Kippur War. But do not give me a rehash of the history. Get to your analysis. I've had in previous classes, and in this class we're going to talk about the Fort Hood shooting, and I've had people give half their paper on what happened at Fort Hood with Nidal Hasan. I don't want the history. I know what happened at Fort Hood. Get to the point of the intel failure or the organizational failure surrounding the Fort Hood shooting. Don't rehash the history. Please, please do not do that. Do not give me a laundry list. We're going to talk about 9/11 in this class and issues related to the intelligence failure surrounding 9/11. Don't give me 15 things that are wrong with the intelligence community and why it failed in 9/11. I don't want 15 things. I'd rather you focus on 2 or 3 things and drill down on them than just give me 15 bullet points. It's better to have depth in these papers than it is to have just top-level bullet points. Read current events. You will be tested on current events, or you'll have an assignment every week on current events, and the best is New York Times and Foreign Policy. Economist is good. Washington Post is good. Please try and stay away from the right-wing or left-wing blogs, especially as it relates to issues around intelligence and terrorism and criminal law enforcement. These are there's a lot of bad things, let's just say, when you get politicized with some of the writing out there. But again, the mainstream New York Times, Foreign Policy is good, Economist is good, Washington Post is good as well. And then finally, know the difference between plagiarism and research. A lot of you might be coming from the federal government, where you are oftentimes encouraged to plagiarize. I just did it at my day job just last week. That is quite different than what you will see in an academic environment. And what I'm going to show you here is, let's make sure it comes up here, a case where a student at the Army War College, who would later become a senator, tried to plagiarize, or really didn't know the difference between plagiarism and analysis. So what this is, he was graduating for the War College, he would later become a senator, and he handed out his thesis, and it turns out a good portion of his thesis was plagiarized. And what you see, and I'll send this article out, what you see in yellow is things that he took word for word from another source, but he didn't put it in quotes. So in the real world, or in the government, a lot of times you'll do that, and just because you're trying to make sure you get the word for word from an operations order or from a standard operating procedure, right? But in the academic world, you do not do that. You do not go word for word without. He tries to attribute, and you can see the footnote here, but you still don't go word for word without putting it in quotations. So you can see his this is his thesis, and I'll be honest, if you're using your first sentence of your thesis to and you're using word for word from another source, you haven't done your work very well. You haven't done your analysis. And you go down his thesis. Everything you see in yellow is word for word without putting it in quotes. And he tries to, I hate to say this, cover his butt, but to put a citation there. But if you're using it word for word, it has to be in quotes. If you're going to take something, a passage out of another source, this is the way you're supposed to do it. You're supposed to change the font and indent it. And this is what you're supposed to do. I'll be guaranteed, though, in our papers, because they're so short, you don't really need to take whole passages out of another source. I really discourage that. So you can see there in yellow, again, word for word. What you see in red is he took word for word from another source, in this case, a Harvard paper, and he didn't cite it. That's plagiarism. And you go down his thesis, and yellow is what he's taking word for word from another source. What you see in red is he's taking word for word from another source without citing it. Again, and you could go see it, and if you do this big red, where he's taking it word for word from another source without citing it, you are already, that'll get you kicked out of Georgetown. That is a pretty serious issue. And again, you could see his whole paper in yellow, he's taking word for word while citing. In red, he's taking it word for word without citing. So good work by the New York Times, not so good work by this Army War College graduate who later become a senator. I guarantee you he didn't realize when he was a senator that this would come back to bite him, but it did. So word of caution out there. And if there's questions or issues on plagiarism and you don't know, please ask, because again, a lot of us come from an environment where plagiarism might be encouraged, but in an academic world, that these things are a no-no.